Welcome to Malpractice Podcast.
Is it you or me?
It's definitely one of us.
Okay, well, are you ready?
Are you ready to get started?
Yes, I'm ready.
Me too.
What up, girl?
Hi.
Hi.
Good morning.
Okay, if you're listening to these in order, this is a re-recording of the original opioid episode. So we're aware that our original audio was shit.
Listen, it was a learning experience.
It was a learning experience.
Yeah. And honestly,
I think this is this our third episode in the series? If we started it from back in the day.
yeah, it was right up there, top 5.
Yeah. So this is a re-recording of that episode. Welcome, and you're welcome for the improved audio.
You are welcome. That's twerking welcome.
Twerking welcome. Yes, you are twerking and you're welcome.
You are welcome.
I'm not here to tell you what to do. Twerk or don't twerk.
Yeah, it's your business.
I listened, while I was preparing to re-record, I listened to the first, few minutes of when we did the original recording, and I was telling everyone that you had turned me on to these, mini bite-sized bell peppers.
Are you serious?
Yes. If you
Why
ain't about
are
that
we
mini
the same?
bite-sized bell pepper life,
They're so cute.
they're delicious.
They're so cute.
What are they even called? I don't know. They're
Michelle calls them jalapeno-sized bell peppers.
That's exactly what they are, but I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
That's what she calls them.
Anyway, I dip them in
Yep.
different dipping sauces.
You don't have to go into any more detail. You just said, I dip them. I'm like, yeah, you do.
It's a bop.
That shit is so good.
Highly recommend those tiny baby bell peppers. This is not... Big Bell Pepper did not sponsor this ad. This is just an unpaid promotion.
The bell pepper monopoly did not.
Yeah.
But they can.
I mean...
Hit us up.
Holler, Big Bell Pepper.
I literally imagined a big bell pepper. I was like, what is she talking about?
You almost made me spit my drink out.
I was like, what is happening? I'm here for it, but
just one big bell pepper.
Where's the big bell pepper?
To rule them all.
Yeah. I was like, oh,
yeah.
cool, I guess. Is this some sort of VeggieTales situation? I don't know.
And it's also sentient, so it's paying us for ads in this scenario. I don't know.
I like it.
Why not? Yeah. Do you want to jump right in?
Dude, I want to jump way in.
Okay. Because this episode is long and it's a lot.
I liked this. This is one of my favorite episodes.
Yeah.
I really learned a shit ton from this episode when you did it.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I wanted to re-record the audio for this. So you clicked on this episode, so you already know what it is. But today we're talking about the opioid epidemic. I think it's a super important episode, and we'll be releasing part 2 as a part of our continuation of season 3. That's going to talk about the current lawsuit and everything that's going on with Purdue Pharma. But in this episode today, we'll get up to that point and everything before then.
Yeah, a bop.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get into it's going to get dark and then it gets better. Okay.
Not really. It gets fucking trash.
Yeah, it'll get better in episode part 2, kind of. Okay. According to the CDC, drug overdose deaths rose 400% from 1999 to 2018.
400%?
Yes.
That doesn't sound real.
It literally doesn't.
It doesn't sound real.
There was a period of time where 130 people in America were dying every single day of opioid overdose. It is still, to this day, considered the deadliest drug crisis in American history. So today, I'm going to give you all the dirty deets on the opioid epidemic, which is essentially a story of insane financial profiteering, reckless prescription writing, and death on a completely unbelievable scale.
Literally, we just did the unbelievable part of that.
Yes.
Without it being scripted. You're welcome.
I don't know how it gets worse, but somehow it gets worse. So...
Oh, God. Okay.
The 3 drugs we can all blame for the current epidemic are prescription pain pills, specifically things like morphine and oxycodone or OxyContin. heroin, and fentanyl.
Okay.
All of these are classified as opioids, which are medically prescribed to treat pain. What were we going to say?
Heroin is classified the same as oxy.
Yes.
If you are in a room and someone's like, "Oh, there's heroin," and you're in the same room, get out. Just get smooth out of there.
Right. So all three of those are classified as opioids, which are medically prescribed or have been historically prescribed to treat pain.
Heroin has been prescribed.
Yes.
For pain management.
Yeah. For like really long periods of time. We're going to get into the whole history.
God damn.
So the way that this basically works is your brain and the surrounding nervous system has a ton of what we call opioid receptors. And opioid drugs bind to those receptors to create the effect of relieving pain, right?
It's kind of crazy that it doesn't actually relieve pain. It's just fake.
It just makes you feel like it's relieved.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. And they do this partially by causing the release of endorphins, aka happy neurotransmitters that basically just tell your body that like everything is chill.
I already knew that because of Legally Blonde. And endorphins make you happy. And then happy people don't kill their husbands.
Right.
I mean, I do think some people that are happy kill their husbands. Have you ever seen Snapped?
Oh, I have. Love Snapped.
I know.
But also,
same.
In general, just as a general, maybe you don't kill your spouse if you're happy. But yeah, so those endorphins. And you're actually completely right about the idea that they basically produce an analgesic or anti-pain effect, as well as like a generally pleasurable experience caused by endorphins. While they are considered now the most dangerous prescription drug, they can also offer people with debilitating pain lots of relief because current estimates suggest that in the U.S. alone, over 100 million adults suffer from chronic pain.
Yeah. Actually, when you told me you were going to do this episode again, I was like looking at chronic pain.
Yeah. It's crazy, right?
It is absolutely crazy. I don't want to like derail the episode, but there's like so much about chronic pain. And I just want to say as a PSA, a strong percentage of people who have chronic pain lived in, I mean, there are all sorts of people, but like in nursing homes and like assisted care facilities. And something that I was reading about was like advocacy for your loved ones that are in those facilities who might be being given a drug problem for their pain. So if you have a loved one in one of those facilities, you should make sure that you are well aware of what is being prescribed to them so that you can like intervene. Because it's crazy.
Yeah, and part of the problem is that opioids are not actually even very good at treating chronic pain.
Right. It just like covers it.
Yes.
And then it's
kind
back.
of kicks the can down the road. And part of the problem is that when these drugs are present, your body slows down the production of its own naturally occurring or endogenous opioids so that you build up what are called dependency and tolerance. Dependency is kind of the biggest issue here because chronic pain management generates addiction because lots of people who take opioids over time become dependent, meaning that if they stop taking it, they'll experience withdrawal. And that's actually not the same as addiction.
Right.
Yeah, and then they also build up tolerance, which means you need more of the drug to produce the same effect that you felt last time. And that leads people to feel like they need more and more over time. So without consulting their doctors in many cases, people would just start taking more of the prescribed drug.
Yep.
And when patients reported reduced results from the same amount of a drug, before doctors really understood the risks of this, they would also just continue to prescribe higher doses.
Right. Just like putting fuel to the fire. It is crazy.
Exactly. And when you start building up a tolerance, that's when it becomes an issue because building up a tolerance dramatically increases your risk for addiction. Some people needed the feeling of release so badly that they would crush up and snort or inject prescribed opioids, which makes overdosing much, much easier.
Jesus Christ.
Right. As of 2018, over 400,000 people have died as the result of opioid overdose in the last 20 years. And that number has actually increased by about 100,000 since 2018.
Yeah, that I was about to say, I'm sure it's much more now. And then when did opioid usage start and or the prescription of those things start? Because I'm sure people were using some sort of something before, herbal or whatever.
That's a great question. It's by no means a new drug.
Right.
So I'm going to start with like a rundown of the kind of overall timeline.
Okay, perfect. You know I love history.
I know you do. So people have been using opioids originally derived from the poppy plant for over 8,000 years.
That's crazy to me because in The Wizard of Oz, like they pass out in the poppy field.
Yep. Opioids.
Because they're drugged.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's like a children's movie and everyone's like, yay. And I was like, wait a minute.
Yay, poppies. No, I mean, historically, though, everybody loves opioids. Like, if you go back through history, everyone loves it. From ancient China to the Middle Ages to modern time, people have never stopped using opium. The first reference was from Mesopotamia around 3400 BC, so it's a super old drug.
Yeah.
Ancient Sumerians actually called it Hul Gil, which means the joy plant.
Same.
People like it. So, morphine was the first opioid introduced in Europe, and it was named for the Greek god of dreams, Morpheus, because it produces like a foggy, kind of dreamlike effect. And then morphine was first introduced to America during the Revolutionary War, but it was popularized during the Civil War when we started importing it to help soldiers with pain caused by, like war injuries.
Yeah.
And they were basically allowed to like use it and abuse it with no consequences or restrictions whatsoever. So,
well, I mean, most things weren't restricted.
No, right.
For white men at that time.
Right. Hindsight is 20/20, but now we know that it's like a massive problem. So at the time, by 1830, over 1/3 of all poisoning deaths were related to opium.
Jesus.
And it, like we said, along with other drugs like cocaine, was not being regulated literally at all.
Love that.
So
love not regulating stuff. We don't keep documents at that time, and we don't regulate
We don't
shit.
regulate drugs. Especially super dangerous drugs like opioids. We don't care
no.
about it.
Why would we do that?
Right. So immediately following the Civil War, basically everyone was on opioids. Approximately 400,000 soldiers who survived the Civil War were addicted, not just on it, addicted to opioids.
They were addicted. Jeez. How did they keep that? How did they know that?
That's a great question. Basically, I think
I always wonder that when historians say things, I'm like, who told you that? Who was keeping track?
Yeah, a lot of the prescription data at the time comes from doctors who kept records of like what they prescribed. So someone did a lot of work like accumulating all of those records.
Yeah.
And
putting them in something digital, hopefully.
Totally, yeah.
That's not it.
Yeah. What's really interesting is that as the 19th century went on, white women started to make up most of those addicted to pain medication because of, number one, cultural expectations that men should basically just deal with it, and being manly was like dealing with pain, which, woof.
Toxic masculinity in the prime.
Literally ruins everything.
Yeah.
So at this time, doctors were prescribing opioids for anything from like a toothache to diarrhea.
That is so crazy.
Right.
Like, how you feel bad? Here, have some heroin.
Oh, you're pooping a lot? Heroin. Headache? Heroin.
What?
One survey of American medical textbooks at the time found suggestions for opioid prescription for 150 different ailments.
150?
Yes.
What are they, stub toe?
Yeah. At the time, it was like
I'm sure
the single most commonly prescribed drug during the 19th century. So basically,
oh my God,
everyone who could get their hands on it was on it.
Yikes.
By the end of the 1800s, in 1895, roughly 1 in every 200 Americans was addicted to opioids.
That's crazy.
And part of that was just who had access to it.
That is wild.
Right? And that was mostly upper and middle class white women had access to it, and it was considered like socially okay for them to use it.
Yeah.
Other people were basically expected to deal with their pain. By the late 1800s, women made up 60% of opium addicts.
Was it white women or just women in general?
The statistic that I found said women, but the majority of those were definitely white women because they were the ones who had access to like physicians.
Yeah. But honestly, I'm not super surprised.
Yeah. What's really interesting, though, is that it's actually still the case that women, and particularly white women, are still more likely to get an opium prescription than men or women of color.
Because of racism.
Right. There's a lot of research to support the idea that on average, doctors don't value pain complaints from patients of color the same way they do from white patients, and they often hold a false belief that white patients are less likely to get addicted, according to the National Women's Health Network.
I don't know where they got that idea. That has no basis at all.
No, literally none. They just think it's true.
And on the second PSA of the day from me, if you are a person of color and you are going to the doctor and you want something and they refuse to give it to you, you should ask them, say fine, and then can you note in my chart that I asked and you you denied.
Excellent recommendation. And I think one of the people that we interviewed said something really similar that was like, just make sure they note it in your chart.
Yeah, you have to be like, okay, well, note it in my chart.
Yeah, put it in the chart. Exactly. There's also, this is weird, for some reason, femme-identifying people have this phenomenon called telescoping, where they are more susceptible to becoming dependent on a drug for some reason, even after taking a smaller amount for a shorter period of time.
That's like proven?
Yes.
Why is that?
Nobody really knows.
I don't know what to say. That is crazy.
Yeah, there's like a ton of potential reasons, but it's crazy.
Okay, so we're in the 1800s, which is my least favorite time period.
It's everyone's least favorite time period, besides any time before that.
Literally any time before.
Like yesterday? Yeah. Same. So back to the history. Late 1800s, early 1900s, doctors know now that opioids are addictive and that people are overdosing a lot. Like, this is well-known information at this point. The problem, and this is where it gets a little complicated, the problem for doctors is partially that they don't really have any alternatives. So when patients come to them for chronic or acute pain, they pretty much only had one solution. Because keep in mind, there are no other over-the-counter pain medications at all at this point.
Did they have, like, chiropractors at that time?
I have no idea.
I'm only asking that because...
How could I possibly know?
I don't know. But I'm only asking because on one of these, like, chronic pain management, the CDC recommends, like, going to the chiropractor in place of, like, opioids.
Yeah. So I don't really know how this falls at that time, but I also... Part of the issue with that and also with like physical therapy is that it's not always covered by insurance.
Did they have insurance in the 1800s?
That's what I was going to say. This is the 1800s, so who knows? Like, they rode horses. What do they know about health insurance?
They don't know anything. When did health insurance start?
It's another episode.
I'm about to be mad about health insurance.
Literally.
They're trash.
Yeah, they're so weird
and
picky. I mean, on purpose, right?
I'm going to do
trash
a
on purpose
episode about health insurance.
It's like our most popular episode. Everyone hates health insurance. So basically, the moral of the story, though, is at this time, patients are coming to doctors with either acute or chronic pain, and either way, they have literally one solution, and it's drugs.
That's so sad.
But when doctors began seeing what an issue it was during this time period, the number of opioid prescriptions did start to slow down.
That's good.
So they started being a little bit more conservative. And then in the late 1800s, other things start coming around. So aspirin was invented in 1899. So that's like a milder, basically non-addictive drug was now available over the counter, and people could get some pain relief without taking heroin or morphine, which was not possible before.
That's so crazy that was the go-to. I'm just so shook about heroin being, like, prescribed.
Oh, speaking of aspirin, do you know who was prescribing and making at the time heroin? It was Bayer.
I'm not surprised.
The same people who made aspirin were making heroin. So
we're throwing around the terms making heroin a lot here, and I just don't even know how one would do that.
I mean, the thing about it is, like, heroin has this idea of being just a street drug, but before it was that, it was like an injectable, basically like morphine. Okay, so at this same time, doctors began writing to medical journals and state and federal government officials to basically say, hey, this shit's dangerous. So new state regulations in the early 1900s meant that instead of buying opiates over the counter, you had to have a prescription. So that was good.
Wait, you could buy them over the counter?
Hell yes.
Heroin?
Like a Pez dispenser. Absolutely.
Get out of here.
Yeah. They were literally for sale at every, I think it was like 1 in 10 pharmacies.
That's crazy.
Sold them over the counter. Yeah. Because there were no restrictions, and they were like, whatever, we're making money off this. But remember, at this point, they're changing laws, but here's the issue. 1 out of every 200 Americans is already addicted to opioids when they became illegal, right?
Yeah.
Well, those people don't just stop being addicted because you can't get it over the counter anymore.
So now it's about to be in the streets.
Right. And this is the 1900s, so the American government is not thinking about addiction as like a medical problem at all. So that's when opium dens got super popular in urban areas. Rich and poor people alike could walk into an opium den and smoke a bowl of poppy extracts that would create the same effect as morphine.
That is wild.
What's wild is that while aspirin was invented in 1899, the year before, Bayer also invented and started marketing heroin as a wonder drug. We already said that.
Yikes.
Yeah.
We're just throwing around the word heroin a lot.
It's going to keep coming up.
Willy-nilly.
It's a whole thing.
Oh my God.
Like, anytime you talk about opioids, you absolutely have to talk about heroin. Because
I know, but just like, what?
Oh, it was actually marketed as a safer alternative to morphine.
Is that true?
Yes.
Is it safer than morphine?
Oh, absolutely not.
Oh, you said yes.
You were asking me, is that how they marketed it? I was like, yeah,
let me ask that again.
No.
You said yes too strongly. I said, wait a minute.
Oh, certainly not. No, it's not safer. It's just that's what they said. So heroin at the time was being marketed even to children as like a cough medication.
Get the fuck out of here.
Uh-huh. In the 1920s and 30s, heroin was legal and readily available, and it was actually supposed to end the morphine crisis.
Morphine crisis. Just replace that with a heroin crisis.
That's exactly what happened. So pharma companies started running ads that basically made people want heroin.
Oh, big pharma.
They marketed it directly to consumers, and lawmakers were like, hang on. This is getting out of hand.
Yeah, good job.
Yeah. I mean, so that's when the first law was passed in 1909 that was designed to stop the import of opium, and it made possession of smokable opium punishable by up to 2 years in prison.
That's not helpful. The people who are addicted, to punish them.
Oh, right.
Punish the people who are making it.
So here's the thing. Throughout this episode and the next episode, they are always going to target for punishment the people who are doing the drugs.
Yeah, of course they are. It's easier.
That's just what happens. I mean, that's what
always fucking happens.
Right.
It's just easier. It's
pretty
trash.
Standard operating procedure. But this law in 1909 was partially passed because there was like a culture shift, and partially it was because it tied opium abuse to opium dens that people linked with what they considered like shifty behavior like sex work and gambling, which was also happening there.
Right. So they just hate all fun. Yeah, got it.
Yes. Opium was also brought over by Chinese people, and there was some heavy racism against Chinese immigrants.
100%.
So that didn't help.
Yep.
But basically, what this law actually did was increase the price of opium, which meant that people who were still addicted just went for more potent versions of it instead. What it didn't do was prevent overdoses.
It didn't solve any problems.
Go figure. So next, in 1914, the Harrison Act made it so that opioids could be regulated and taxed. So basically, where drug abuse had previously been and should always have been a medical issue, it now became a legal issue because it became like criminally punishable to be in possession of these drugs. This sort of acts as the weird, fucked up basis for today's drug laws. But the idea was originally to make things more transparent and ensure that doctors only prescribed opioids for a real medical reason. The actual effect was that it basically became opioid prohibition because it was so hard to get, which meant that doctors basically stopped prescribing those things. So while morphine use did decrease significantly, both drugs began to be sold in underground markets.
Yeah.
So people were already taking it, and so many people were already taking it, that the two alternatives were either go through the horrifying process that is withdrawals or get their drugs illegally.
Right. And what are you going to choose?
Most people chose to get their drugs illegally.
Correct.
So fast forward to Prohibition, alcohol is being literally illegally smuggled in everywhere in America, which actually set up underground networks for the movement of illegal substances.
Right.
So post-World War II, opioids flood back into the market, which became concentrated in urban areas, and it brought access to these drugs to communities of color in a way that had never existed before. And that led to the passing of the Boggs Act, which is super ridiculous, and it set mandatory minimum drug sentencing and definitely targeted minority communities, as we all now know.
Yeah.
Right.
Trash, but yeah, we do know.
So the next law to get passed to target opioid use was the Anti-Heroin Act of 1924.
Finally.
Right. And the whole purpose of this was that it made producing, selling, or consuming heroin illegal. So, again, this was another step toward making drug abuse illegal rather than a health issue.
Yeah.
And what this all did collectively was just lead to a sharp increase in the number of people being incarcerated for drug abuse.
Right. It's stupid, but at least they targeted heroin, which I was been waiting for this entire time since Mesopotamia.
Now, the fact that it took until the 20s, not ideal.
Not ideal.
But part of this, drive to incarcerate people was driven by who was doing the drugs.
Yeah.
Right?
100%.
One author said that the opium addict of the 1800s was like a sick little old lady, and people weren't really interested in throwing them in jail.
I am.
But by the time it makes it to urban communities, you are.
I'm just kidding.
That was funny. And then in the 1900s, when it makes it to urban communities, they're like, it's a young tough on a street corner hanging out with their friends and snorting heroin, which is a much less sympathetic picture of opium addiction, right?
Yeah, I want to throw them in jail, so be quiet, you.
So with all of these legal crackdowns and how difficult it became to find, addiction waned, and at this point, by the 1920s, only 2 out of every 1,000 people in the U.S. had an opioid addiction. So that's cutting way down from 1 out of every 200.
Yeah, because everyone was in prison.
Accurate. What I will say about the early opioid crisis in America is that it is very different from the modern one. So doctors prescribing opioids in the 18th, 19th, 20th century were mostly well-intentioned and dealing with really sick and injured people who had literally no other option.
Unless they just had diarrhea. You bitches could have gone somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that bad, right?
You could have let it run its course. I don't know why you needed heroin for that.
Feels that way, but okay. So, but for people who were coming back with no leg after
that's a different
World War
story.
I, sure, I get it.
Don't
right?
ask me for permission. You do what you need to do.
You do what you got to do. Did it spark a national epidemic? Absolutely. Was it intentional and planned and sinister? No, I don't think so.
I don't think medical professionals let me make sure. No, I don't think them as a whole are we're about to get everyone addicted. I don't think that's true, but I think they were this thing is bad. Here you go.
Right. The reason I'm making the distinction is because the modern opioid crisis was 100% sinister as fuck.
Yeah, I don't think this one is sinister. I do think it's in the knowledge and still the doing of it.
But I don't think it was mwahahaha, like this one is. So, speaking of that, next I want to talk about the Sackler family, Purdue Pharma, and the modern opioid crisis, which we'll talk a lot about in part 2.
Boo! They're trash.
Yeah, they are trash.
I already know they're trash.
So, there are basically 3 giant waves of the opioid crisis in the U.S., and the first one starts with prescription pills. When it was released in 1995, an opioid drug called OxyContin was considered a huge medical breakthrough. They called it a long-lasting narcotic drug that people could take to completely eliminate moderate to severe chronic pain. So people everywhere were stoked because they're like, aspirin is not cutting it.
Yeah.
I need something more. And at this time, Purdue Pharma is telling everyone this is non-addictive. It's fantastic. You're going to want to take this, right?
Did they know at that time that it was addictive?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, I love that. Okay,
we'll get into that in part 2, but there's 100% evidence that they knew it was addictive when they were promoting it as non-addictive.
Big trash.
Yeah. The drug would also end up generating over $35 billion in revenue for the makers, Purdue Pharma. From 1997 to 2002, OxyContin prescriptions would increase from 670,000 to 6.2 million.
Jesus Christ.
So lots of people were taking this new drug when it came out. And that continued. By 2012, there were enough of these pills being produced in America and being prescribed that every single person in America could have gotten their hands on a bottle.
That's crazy.
Right. Now, OxyContin is made up solely of oxycodone, a drug similar in structure to heroin.
Oh, God, here we go again.
That is actually twice as powerful as morphine.
Jesus Christ.
And it doesn't hurt that simultaneously, when they were releasing this drug, Purdue Pharma launched an insane marketing campaign in an effort to assure the doctors who were prescribing these narcotics that it was safe and even healthy for patients.
They're lying.
Oh, yeah. And at this point, they're even paying doctors to jump on the bandwagon and talk it up with their colleagues. They literally called it the drug to, quote, start with and stay with, because they wanted people to take it long term.
Forever.
Yeah.
Disgusting.
It's important to note that at the time, pharma groups promoting the use of OxyContin were adamant that it was non-addictive, which we now know was false, and we know that they knew at the time that it was false. We already talked about that.
Yikes.
So, for example, if someone was injured in like a work accident and was being prescribed opioids, they had a significant chance of becoming addicted during that time, partially because the drugs were being overprescribed and poorly regulated.
Love that. That's a great combo.
Right. Exactly. By that point, this person may have lost their job and no longer be able to afford their insurance or their medication, so the less expensive alternatives like heroin and fentanyl also explode in popularity. The American Society for Addiction Medicine says that 4 out of every 5 people who try heroin started with using prescription painkillers first.
That's crazy.
4 out of 5.
That's really shocking.
Yeah. So of those 3 that we talked about earlier, this is where the second wave comes in the form of heroin.
Oh, back to heroin.
We're back to heroin, yes. From 2011 to 2014, heroin killed nearly 30,000 people because it was cheaper and more readily available alternative to prescription pain pills. So beginning in 2010, there was a sharp increase in the number of opioid deaths that involved heroin.
Jeez.
Now, since 2013, the third, and to me, honestly, the scariest wave has taken over, and this one is in the form of fentanyl. Fentanyl has 50 times the strength of heroin, and it is extremely cheap to make.
Oh, perfect.
Right.
The perfect storm.
So exactly. So drug dealers started lacing or cutting, quote unquote, cutting heroin and counterfeit prescription pills with fentanyl. In the last 7 years, over 100,000 people have died from fentanyl overdoses, which is actually super easy to do.
That's so scary.
It's so scary. I want you to guess, how much fentanyl do you think it would take to kill you? Like, how much of it?
A sniff? 2 sniffs? I don't know. How is it measured?
Like grams or grams or milligrams or...
I don't even know what a gram is.
Yeah.
Like 5 grams.
It's actually about 3 milligrams.
No.
And 3 milligrams is a dose the size of 10 grains of salt is enough to kill an adult human. So you just have to have literally 10 grains of salt worth to die.
That's so scary.
It's crazy. From 1999 to 2017, opioid overdose rates increased by 600%.
That's, again, that unbelievable number.
Right.
600%.
Totally. In 2017, more people in the U.S. died from opioid overdose than from HIV or AIDS at the peak of the AIDS epidemic.
Yep.
What came along with opioid prescriptions that wasn't immediately apparent was another terrifying fact. In 2015, for the first time in over 100 years, the life expectancy in the U.S. began to decline because of opioids.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
Mayday.
Right.
That is a health crisis.
And the problem is also that these prescriptions at this time were readily available everywhere just a few years ago.
Yeah.
In 2016, 1 in 5 Americans received an opioid prescription.
That's... Nope.
Yeah. So, in short, and the thing about it is, like, everybody was taking these. In 2017, there were 200 million opioid prescriptions filled in America.
And it's because no one knew the truth, or what?
Yeah. Yeah, because the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma lied. And we'll get into all of that in the second episode. But basically, the opioid epidemic in America is still, to this day, affecting rural communities, urban areas, all races, genders, socioeconomic groups, etc.
Everyone.
Everyone. But it's affecting different communities differently. The rise in white prescription drug users or heroin users led lawmakers to push for reduced sentencing for nonviolent illicit drug offenses and expansion to access of addiction treatment. At the same time, in Black and Latino communities, drug-addicted individuals continue to be incarcerated rather than treated for their addiction. So, obviously still a huge issue. So, I want to end on doing a quick overview of the Sackler family, the people who own Purdue Pharma. Arthur Sackler and his siblings were the children of Jewish immigrants who grew up in Brooklyn during the Great Depression. After medical school, Arthur becomes super interested in the biology of psychiatric disorders. He and his brother are really the reason that today the U.S. allows marketing of drugs and medical devices like the ads you see on TV, or you would see if you still had cable, but no one does.
I don't. Never heard of her.
Same. Haven't seen a drug ad in years.
And don't want to.
By creating these ads, though, for medical companies like the ones who sold Valium during the 1960s, the Sackler family got hella rich. Like, hella rich. Using pharmaceutical advertising, one of their drugs, Valium, became the first drug ever to sell over $100 million in profits. In one interview, Alan Francis, the former chair of psychiatry at Duke University School of Medicine, says most of the questionable practices that propelled the pharmaceutical industry into the scourge that it is today can be attributed to Arthur and the Sackler family.
Boo! Everyone.
Boo.
Boo with me. Boo.
So basically, the Sacklers got mega rich. They're one of the 10 richest families in America.
Of course they are.
The FBI has been investigating them on and off since the 1950s because they have some truly shady business dealings.
Well, we love an FBI involvement.
Oh, then you're going to love part 2.
We love it, don't we? We both love FBI involvement. That's how you know this shit is good.
Absolutely, I do. If there's an FBI file on it, it's a good story.
It's a good story. That's period.
In 1952, the Sackler family purchased the Purdue Pharma Company, and 8 years after Arthur's death, they started selling OxyContin, which again is way stronger than morphine. They started selling it like readily.
That's so crazy.
They have paid hundreds of millions of dollars in fine because it has now been proven, again, we'll talk about this in part 2, that their marketing was false, their drugs were dangerous, and highly, highly addictive.
Trash.
As of the time of the release of this episode, the Sacklers recently agreed to pay $600 million in fines and other payments, which is one of the largest amounts ever paid by a drug company in such a case. Medical experts today say that the Purdue Pharma Company is almost entirely to blame for the opioid epidemic, which explains why just 1 week ago, as of the initial release of this episode, they reached an $8 billion settlement with the U.S. Justice Department, and they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So, for part 1, I want to stop there, and in part 2, we'll get into the nitty-gritty details of the modern opioid crisis and how the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma are exactly to blame.
Damn.
So for now, that's what I know about the history of opioids in America.
Let's get on to part 2.
We'll see you for part 2.
Hey, Mal Pals. Thanks for listening. The sources and links for this episode can be found in our show notes. If you haven't already, go follow us on social media. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter @Malpractice Podcast. You can also send topic suggestions, questions, or concerns to our email, malpracticepodcast@gmail.com. And just as a reminder, if you like what you're hearing, you should definitely subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. And don't forget, malpractice makes perfect.